So, time travel. Stephen Hawking's question: if time travel is possible in the future, then how come our world now isn't full of time travelers? Where are they? By implication, I suppose he's saying, I'm not sure if he said this explicitly, possibly he did. He's saying that he doesn't think it is possible, ever, that it never will be possible. I'm going to give you three possible reasons why, if time travel is possible, we don't have time travelers all over the place right now. I'll tell you what the three are up front. One, maybe it takes a huge amount of energy to travel back in time, and therefore it's not something you do it'll never be something that you do as an everyday occurrence. Two, maybe time travel kills you, so therefore it's not something you do except in extreme circumstances. Three, maybe there's not much point time traveling. Okay, let's take to point one. The amount of energy involved. Now, let's think about what time travel might look like in practice. It seems to me that time travel, as presented in most stories and most movies and so on, is kind of fanciful, in the sense of this. Why would you send matter back in time? I mean, we don't, even in our world now, we're moving away from sending hard copies of letters. We're emailing things. It's so much easier, or texting it, or whatever. We're reducing the amount of information, and therefore the amount of matter required. We're digitizing it, and the less matter that you're sending, the easier it is. In other words, it's much easier to send an email or a text, which is a digitized form of the message, than the actual hard copy of the message. Right? That's obvious. It's a no-brainer, because all you're doing is sending a stream of electrons rather than the actual atoms that make up a piece of paper. All right. So if we're talking about travelling back in time, that's obviously going to take a huge amount of energy and technology. Therefore, you'd want to minimise the amount of stuff that you're sending back in time. So you wouldn't send an actual person, the actual person's body back in time. If you were thinking about it practically, you'd say, well, what's the minimum amount of information, the minimum amount of matter I want to send back in time, and therefore to minimise the amount of energy you're going to need. So you would presumably find some way of digitising someone's consciousness or personality or whatever. That's probably something that we're beginning to think about anyway. If you look at HBO's Westworld, the idea that you can reduce someone's consciousness and personality into a small sphere like that, but if, that the sphere is merely the container of the information. You wouldn't need to send the sphere back in time, just something carrying that information, rather than say, how do we send this actual body, which is a frail container for a human personality anyway? Why would you risk sending that fragile container of a biological body back in time, rather than some sort of electronic digitization of someone's consciousness? Whether that's possible or not, or in what way that could be possible, that's the question for science and science fiction. Although, Feynman always talked about the fact that mathematically speaking, a positron, in other words, the antimatter equivalent of an electron, travelling forwards in time is the same as an electron travelling backwards in time. So there's an idea. If you could create a machine that could send positrons, anti-electrons, antimatter electrons, forward in time, in other words, just along a current made up of anti-electrons, then in every mathematical way that's the same as actual electrons travelling backwards in time. The philosophy of that is a bit hard to get your head round, but the mathematics of it are pretty sound, right? There's no theoretical reason that you couldn't do that. So maybe, I'm not saying that's how it'll be done, but that's something you'd be looking into if we gave you that as a project to do realistically. The thing is about antimatter is it would take a huge amount of energy to contain it, because of course the minute it meets, or the instant it meets, the instant a positron meets an electron, it annihilates into pure energy, and you lose the information that they were carrying. So you would, presumably the containment device would be extremely expensive, extremely technologically advanced, and take a lot of energy. Stop beeping, I'm recording. and therefore it's not something that you would do lightly. If you think about, the amount of, you could equally say, well, okay, if nuclear bombs are theoretically possible, if nuclear explosions are possible, how come there's not nuclear explosions all over the world? Well, because they release a huge amount of energy and they're incredibly dangerous, all right? That doesn't mean that it's not possible. It means that we've reached an international agreement so far anyway that this is not something we're going to do every day of the week all over the world. So that's a possible explanation to this objection. Secondly, what if time travel kills you? Now, let's say you did digitize someone's consciousness and you sent it back in time. What would you do? So you're not sending the actual body back in time. And what would you do with the person left? In other words, is effectively what you're doing cloning the person into two distinct personalities, distinct people, and sending one back in time, but the other one still exists at this point in the future, or in the present, that we've sent the person back in time from. Maybe now there's a I've seen this on a movie or TV show. I can't remember what it was. So if anyone can point that out to me, can remind me what that was, please tell me. But what if every time you travel back in time, the actual you, the present you, died? So in other words, it's not something that you do lightly. Or maybe philosophically we decide that we have to kill that person, rather than have two copies of them. Or maybe you don't want to be creating multiple clones of the same person. That's dealt with in Altered Carbon. I've not seen the TV series, but I've read the book. Pretty good. Worth a read. And there's a Japanese novel about this too, whose name escapes me, and I'm not allowed to read because my friend says I'm not allowed to. But it deals with the same sort of thing. The idea that when you travel back in time, you travel back from a save point, which is your death. You can only do it when you die, like in a video game where you go back to a previous save point once you die. So it might be that the human cost of time travel is huge, and therefore it's not something you do every day of the week. It's something that's regulated, and people think very carefully about before asking someone effectively to die to travel back in time. Third point, maybe there's no point to it. Okay, let's get back to this Douglas Adams idea, which I've dealt with in a previous one of the Avengers Endgame videos, that you can't change the future. You can't go back in time to change the future at all. That the present is set, that history is set, and therefore if you go back in time to kill baby Hitler and you manage to kill what you think is baby Hitler, actually what it turns out is that wasn't baby Hitler, and your killing of baby Hitler by a time traveller allowed actual Hitler to come to power. That kind of thing, that whatever happens in the past has already happened and you can't change it by time travelling, and in fact by time travelling back, what you're doing is setting up history as we know it, in whatever way it turns out to be. Turns out that we didn't know everything about the past. There's an interesting movie called Predestination, starring Ethan Hawke, which kind of deals with that sort of idea. Although it's not exactly what I'm talking about, but that's worth a look as well. So it might be that if you can't change the past by going back in time, then what's the point? So it might be something that future us only decide to do under extreme circumstances, when we need to get some exact information from the past, or whatever. That all these three are not mutually exclusive. They could all be true, and if you combine all three, then that provides a very extreme set of circumstances under which you would choose to travel back in time. And therefore, again, if travel to the moon is possible, how come the moon isn't full of millions of people? Because it's hard, essentially, because it's hard, but not impossible. Anyway, 3 ideas for you to mull over. Let me know your thoughts. If you disagree, let me know. If you've got any questions, let me know. And if you know the name of that movie I'm talking about, then let me know, because that's really bugging me now. All right, see you next time.